Good Yontif. May we all be sealed, signed into the book of life. The last time I saw and would ever see Gabe Leggman was this past spring at my niece's, his granddaughter Caroline's bat mitzvah brunch. With his wife Sipora at his side, his 3 grown children kibitzing in the backyard, and a gaggle of his grandchildren splashing in his swimming pool, we exchanged warm words as Debbie and I said our goodbyes on our way back to New York from Los Angeles. There was a warm smile on his face, ear to ear, the kind of smile possible only from a man who was deeply aware of the blessings of his life. A smile that was present whenever we saw each other at Passover Seders, at Shabbat dinners, at Simchas, or whenever I had the good fortune to be in the company of my big brother's father-in-law. Gabe passed away a few months later at the age of 92 on the afternoon of July 29th in his favorite chair in the beautiful home that he had built, in full control of his faculties with classical music playing in the background. A passing as gentle, I think, as any person can wish for in this world. Not in a million years, I think, could the 15-year-old Gabe Leggman have imagined the gentle circumstances by which his soul would return to his Creator. Born in the small town of Retag, Romania, Gabe, his parents, and his 3 brothers enjoyed a typical and pleasant village life filled with soccer and chess and Judaism. Gabe's idyllic existence would be upheaved, catastrophically so, when the Nazis and their local collaborators rounded up all the Jews and deported them to the Dej ghetto. From there, Gabe and his family would be transported to Auschwitz, where his mother Sarah and 3 brothers, Alexander, Tiberius, and Ludwig, were murdered. In time, Gabe and his father would be sent from Auschwitz to Buchenwald, from Buchenwald to Remsdorf, and Remsdorf to Theresienstadt. In the spring of '45, with the Russians approaching, Gabe and his father were herded into a sealed underground bunker with hundreds of other inmates with no provisions and left to die. 9 days later, when Theresienstadt was liberated by Soviet troops, on May 9, 1945, Gabe and his father were amongst the very few to emerge alive. 2 weeks after liberation, Gabe and his father were sent back to Romania, and soon enough the horrors of the Nazis were replaced with the trials of communism. Gabe's father was able to emigrate to Israel in '49, but Gabe, conscripted to serve in the army, was refused permission to leave. Gabe never saw his father again, who passed shortly thereafter. Only in 1961, after years of failed attempts to leave the country, would Gabe, by way of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS, be able to emigrate to California by way of Vienna. He was penniless. He had no family and knew not a word of English. "Don't call us, we'll call you," they told him at the employment office, a call which, in the coming decades, he would joke that he had still yet to receive. With what skills he had, Gabe went to work as a dental technician amongst other odd jobs. In time, he would open up a lab with employees of his own. From that one lab, he began to dabble in real estate, a side hustle that would ultimately become his livelihood. The combination of his tireless work ethic, his business acumen, and unshakable optimism enabled Gabe to enjoy a success that well exceeded his impoverished beginnings. Together with his wife Sipora, they achieved the riches of raising 3 children and 9 grandchildren, each one with a unique, powerful, loving, and lasting relationship with their doting grandfather. May your grandfather's memory be for a blessing. Gabe was one of the least negative people who has ever walked this earth. Despite the traumas of the first decades of his life. He never spoke of himself as a victim. Gabe had every reason to reject God, but he held an unwavering faith, laying tefillin every day and living proudly as a Jew. Gabe would have been well within his rights to be suspect of human nature and resent humanity as a whole, but he lived every day with love, with compassion, and generosity of spirit. Having experienced the horrors of Nazism and communism firsthand, Gabe was no Pollyanna, but he leveraged his experiences towards a life of compassion, critical of any person or movement who sought to suppress the humanity of his another. To his dying day, Gabe never forgot what he had lost, asking that his brothers' names, the ones who had been denied proper burial, be inscribed alongside his own on his headstone. A deeply good person, a man who, despite having every reason to hate, had a heart as pure as it was filled with love, never allowing the trauma that was and would always be his to define the future that he sought to create for himself, his family, and all those blessed to know him. Long before Gabe Leggman, and for that matter, long before the Holocaust, as Jews, we've well understood that who we are as individuals and as a community is defined by way of memory. The frequency by which the Bible instructs us to remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, the Jewish obligation to see ourselves as if we personally came out of Egypt or that we ourselves were standing at Sinai to receive the Torah. At times of both joy and sorrow, we remember. It's why we break glasses at Jewish weddings. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, if I forget thee, Jerusalem, if I don't hold you in my memory, even at my happiest hour. It's why when we pray and invoke God's name, we always remember our God to be the same God of Abraham and Isaac, Sarah and Rebekah. It's why Milton Berle could quip that when a person converts to Judaism, they are granted 5,000 years of retroactive persecution. Jews are not the only people for whom remembrance of things past shapes present identity. We're just a particularly good case study. The project of remembrance, part and parcel to the task of living. But what we also know as Jews is that memory consists not just of one, but of two activities. Remembering, yes, but also the act of letting some of those memories go. We need both. The generation of the Exodus had no shortage of sins, the golden calf, the sin of the spies, multiple rebellions and complaints every step of the way. But their greatest sin, the one that tied all the other ones together and ultimately denied them from entry into the land, was their inability to free themselves from the psychological shackles of their servitude. They conjured up imagined pleasures of flesh pots of their Egyptian sojourn and allowed memories of the past to colonize their present to the detriment of their future. But it's not just misplaced nostalgia that impedes our forward momentum. As Jews, we're also on guard against the peril of perseverating in the memories of hurts that are better left behind. Remember, Amalek commands Deuteronomy in reference to our sworn enemy. Blot out their memory. How can one, you might ask, both remember and blot out memory at the same time? The rabbis explain that the commands are not contradictory. We remember, but we let go of the resentment, a cortical pruning that makes each of us who we are and ensures our forward momentum. It shouldn't be lost on any of us that the Yom Kippur ritual, as described in tomorrow's Torah reading, involves not one but two animals, one that's sacrificed and one that's released into the wilderness, representative of that which we must let go. It's a task that sits at the core of this Yom Kippur day, this sifting of memories, of vows, of injuries, insults, and otherwise. What are we going to bring forward? What are we going to let go of? What's the right balance between the two? Aside from the personal loss, the passing of Gabe, the final Holocaust survivor whom I can count within my extended family, has prompted me to reflect on a generational transition and transformation which we're all living through. The passing of a generation of American Holocaust survivors. According to the Claims Conference, the survivor population in the United States has dropped below 50,000, with a 76% projected decline by 2030. The numbers give us a sense of urgency. The landscape is shifting. Whether we're personally descendants of survivors or not, our Jewish identities have all been shaped in the presence of survivors. For me, they were family and family friends sitting at our Shabbos table, out to dinner with my parents, and all over the place. It was both remarkable and altogether unremarkable that I had a Hebrew school teacher with a tattoo on her arm. The same won't be said of the coming generations. Removed in time and testimony from the events of 70+ years ago, there's going to be a new generation of caretakers for Holocaust memory. So I ask you, as we enter this new chapter of history, what shall we remember? And what memories do we allow to fade? Is there a right and a wrong to Holocaust memory? Who decides its correct use? Who calls out when it's abused? What will this next chapter look like? How shall we remember the Holocaust? In its most basic formulation, the answer to the question of Holocaust memory is both straightforward and unequivocal. We must always remember, as long as a Jew has breath to breathe, we remember the 6 million souls, the 1.5 million children who were murdered at the hands of the Nazis and their collaborators. Israel's Holocaust Museum takes its name, Yad Vashem, from the prophet Isaiah, who describes the fear of those individuals who, lacking descendants, face the anxiety of being forgotten. A monument to their names by way of museums, memorials, education, Yom HaShoah observances, B'nai Mitzvah pairings, by any means necessary. We remember and we never forget. But how shall we remember? Is it death or is it life that we remember? Zochreinu l'chaim, we say over and over again throughout the day. Remember us l'chaim, for life. More important than remembering how the 6 million died, it seems to me we have to recall how they lived. Each life representing a millennial-long history of European Jewry, of culture, of literature, of living. If there's an adjustment that awaits this coming chapter of Holocaust remembrance, it's that we need to spend more time learning about those lives as they were lived and less time about those lives as they were lost. In her provocatively titled new book, People Love Dead Jews, author Dara Horn points out that while many people can name and perhaps have even visited 1, 2, maybe 3 concentration camps, just how many of us can name 3 Yiddish authors we know and have read? At Yad Vashem and Battery Park on the National Mall, around the country and throughout the world, these last 70+ years have seen a proliferation of Holocaust museums, Holocaust departments, professorships to memorialize, document, and teach the destruction, to teach how Jews died. We should be proud of this work. It reflects the very best minds, philanthropy, and volunteerism of a generation. And now, let's set some goals for the next 70 years. A massive program of cultural reclamation to honor the lives, not the deaths, of the millions of Jews and millennial-long history about which we solemnly swear never to forget. To the question of whether to remember the lives of the 6 million, there's only one answer, a categorical yes. But more textured is the answer to the question of how we remember the wickedness of the Nazis and their collaborators. Practically speaking, and at risk of stating the obvious, the passing of the generation of survivors also signals the passing of the generation of perpetrators. I well understand over these last 70+ years the need for justice, for reparations, and even for vengeance. Given the horror, how could it be otherwise? But what about the next 70 years? Shall we not loosen our grip of hatred just a little? You know, since his passing, I watched a video of Gabe's story as it was being documented by USC's Shoah Foundation. And as he sat down to be interviewed, Gabe noted that the interviewer had a German accent. And Gabe made a comment to the effect of being comforted in the knowledge that he was in the presence of a German who was on the right side of history. Not so, the woman clarified. Her parents had been card-carrying members of the Nazi Party. She had struggled to come to terms with her family history. Her efforts to preserve Holocaust memory reflected her personal commitment to turn the corner of personal and national history. Now, she may have been exceptional, and it's not as if anti-Semitism and hatreds of all kinds don't persist in Germany and elsewhere. Of course they do, a topic to which I'll turn momentarily. Nor is it a matter of whether we, the living, can forgive on behalf of the dead. It's not, I don't believe, our moral right to do so. It's just the first foundational principle of Jewish theology, that every person and every generation be judged on their own merits. Besides, there's an untold psychic cost to holding on to hatred. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, the Jewish museum about whom I've spoken in the past, was himself a refugee from the Nazis. He toured the world, and every so often he went back to Germany to give concerts. People would ask him, understandably so, how, given what the Germans did, could he go back and sing there? And Carlebach responded, I only have one soul. If I had two souls, I would gladly devote one of them to hating the Germans full time. But I don't. I only have one, and I'm not going to waste it on hating. What differentiates this coming chapter from the last chapter of Holocaust memory? A little less hate. And as sure as I am that in the coming 70 years we must loosen our intergenerational hold on hatred, I'm equally sure that we must redouble our efforts to remember the lessons of the Nazi rise to power. We are presently living in an era of democratic backsliding. The rise of anti-Semitism from the left and the right is one expression of the illiberalism of our times, but it's not the only one. The political violence of Charlottesville, of January 6th, the rise of conspiracy theories on social media, the fierce opposition to immigration, the renewed racism, the refusal to accept election outcomes, the sharp identity politics and toxic polarization of our time, these are all alarm bells. These are all warning signs. These are all the preconditions for the rise of authoritarianism and the failure of democracies. It's happening around the world, in China, in Russia, in Europe, but it's happening right here in our own backyard. The question doesn't have to be as charged as to whether another Holocaust can happen. The question can merely be whether we are that different from Weimar Germany, and whether here and now we too are witnessing the erosion of our own democracy. By a certain telling, the trauma of the Holocaust extended Western democracies a 70-year window that kept our demons in check, demons that I fear are now being let loose. If nothing else, the study of the Holocaust is an object lesson in what happens when societies fail to educate its citizens on the importance of democracy. The Holocaust is a case study spotlighting the shameful tendency of the world to stand idly by. 70 years ago against the Jews, or in our time against the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, Afghan women, and so many others. It was Elie Wiesel who taught that though the Holocaust was a unique and uniquely Jewish event, its implications are universal. We dare not now or in the years to come engage in comparative suffering as if the enormity of our own suffering should preclude a life-saving lesson awaiting another. Just the opposite. As we write this next chapter, let the agonies of our past teach the world today. Let the philanthropy that supported Highest then for Jews support the Afghans now. Let our compassion help others. Let the moral vacuum of humanity's past inaction impel present humanity into action. There is much, so much, that the memory of the Holocaust still has to teach the world, a curriculum whose importance increases in urgency with every passing day. And it's not just the rest of the world who needs to reconsider the lessons of the Holocaust. We, the Jewish people, have to reintegrate the message of the Holocaust into our own self-understanding. For many years, I have argued that while I and perhaps you were part of a generation raised to believe that one must live Jewishly so as not to grant Hitler a posthumous victory, it's a rationale that has long run its course. Remember, yes, always, but if the argument for Jewish living is derived solely by way of Holocaust remembrance, then that's a Judaism that's not deserving of living. The Judaism that we will teach, preach, and practice at Park Avenue Synagogue to live passion-filled Jewish lives will never be independent of the Holocaust, but nor will it ever be dependent upon the Holocaust. And it's more than that. As a people, we have to be vigilant against any attempts from within our fold to instrumentalize the Holocaust towards justifying any aspect of our people's agenda. I understand why, in decades past, so much of Israel education was situated on the Holocaust. March of the Living trips with Israeli flags draped on our shoulders, or trips to Yad Vashem ending with the singing of Hatikva. Not only do I understand such efforts, I actually led such efforts. But now, moving forward, we have to resist the urge to link Zionism too closely to the Holocaust. We have to resist because it's historically inaccurate to link the establishment of Israel with the Holocaust. Zionism long preceded the rise of Nazism. But we also have to resist because it's a linkage that plays directly into the arguments of our enemies, who would have the world believe that if not for the trauma of the Holocaust, there would be no Israel, a specious argument that will become stronger, not weaker, in the years ahead as a living testimony of the survivors fade. Arguments for Jewish life, arguments for the sovereign state of Israel, must stand independently of the Holocaust, even if not especially if, it means rethinking the use of Holocaust memory in both Jewish and public discourse. It is dangerous, it is dishonest, and it's a dishonor to the victims of the Holocaust to weaponize our memory of them for present political purposes. To say the borders of '67 are the borders of Auschwitz, to say the year is 1939 and Iran is Germany, to say or do anything invoking the memory of the Holocaust as some sort of moral shield for policy in Israel or America is historically incoherent, morally repugnant, and a sign of deep failure from within. Remember, yes, but to leverage that memory to cover up our own lapses, or even worse, to justify them, that's an abuse of Holocaust memory to which we must never fall victim. No different than leaving Egypt, no different than standing at Sinai. For as long as Jews will be Jews, we will never forget. We will always be defined by Auschwitz. But it's a memory that must be a prompt for kindness, for compassion, for civility, and for action. As Menachem Rosensaft of the World Jewish Congress, himself the child of survivors, shared with me, it's not the dehumanization that took place that we have to remember. It's a defiant spirit of Jews facing death who refused to become like animals, who refused to allow themselves to be dehumanized by their oppressors, that we must remember. We identify with the victims, but we don't wallow in the victimization. We swear never to forget, even as we loosen our grip on generational resentments, our past pain never instrumentalized to justify present cruelty or ethno-national chauvinisms of any kind. To be defined by Auschwitz is to remember the Jewish inmate who shared their meager rations of what passed for food with a friend or a stranger who was more hungry. The inmate who used her medical training to save the lives of Jewish women and children, even after her own child had been murdered in the gas chamber. The Jewish inmate who sang a song or told a joke to lift the spirits of their barrack mates. The inmate who, in praying to God or refusing to pray to God, were equal manifestations of a determination to remain Jewish and thereby human in the face of the ruthless phalanx whose goal was to destroy both their Jewishness and their humanity. Today and every day we remember. We remember the 6 million just as one day we will remember the survivors who I think would want to be remembered. Julia, as I know your grandfather would want to be remembered, not for dwelling on death, but for rebuilding life, for their resilience, for their courage, for their strength, and for their capacity for hope, for their ability, even in the darkest of nights, to call on God, trustful and unafraid, eftach velo efchad. Their lives reminders not so much of remarkable people, but of just how remarkable people can be, and by extension, all of us. Thus may the 6 million, thus may the survivors, and thus may we here today prove ourselves worthy to be Zochrenu L'chaim, to be remembered for life. Good Yom Tov.